pleasure to introduce Dr. Eva Rose Miller, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at UCL History, as well as being a BC trustee. Her research considers the ancient Middle East, the modern West, and the relationship between the two through asking questions about processes of rediscovery, transmission, and reception. Her current project investigates how imagery uncovered in mid-19th century excavations of ancient Assyrian sites in northern Iraq dating to the 9th to 7th centuries BCE was adapted and revived by European and American artists, architects, politicians, authors, and academics, especially in the US and Germany. She's interested in the wider intellectual climate that shaped and was shaped by this process in which the newly discovered Assyrian antiquity wound up being used by different groups and in different ways to work out what it meant to be modern and Western. Her book, Early Civilization in the American Modern, Images of Middle Eastern Origins in the United States, 1893 to 1939, will be published shortly by UCL Press. I mean, so fairly imminently. She is interested in the history of archaeology and heritage in the Middle East and its imbrication with imperial and national projects. She is also editing with Guillemette Crouzet the forthcoming volume, Finding Antiquity, Making the Modern Middle East, Archaeology, Empires, Nations, and that will be published by Bloomsbury in 2025. Eva's background is in the art, history, and languages of ancient Mesopotamia. She holds a DPhil from the University of Oxford, where her thesis investigated representations of enemy punishment in palace art and Akkadian cuneiform texts of the 7th century BCE, Assyrian monarch Ashurbanipal. She has previously been a teaching fellow for the ancient Middle East at UCL History, a teaching fellow at the University of Birmingham, and the Henri Frankfurt Fellow at the Warburg Institute. But enough of me, let's proceed with what you've all come to hear. Eden in America, exhibiting, performing, and imagining Iraq between two nations. And so thank you very much, Eva, for agreeing to talk to us today.
Right, so I was going to begin with this talk with a sort of apology about my own research interests and how it got me here, but Rosalind has just done that for me. So basically, I'm interested in how ancient Iraq and the rest of the ancient Middle East has been received and reimagined roughly since the mid-19th century mostly through the mid-20th century. And I usually focus on how this discourse operated in the West. My most recent book is about the United States particularly. But at the same time, I also maintain an interest in the history of archaeology and heritage in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East, as it affected and continues to affect the politics of the region. So for a talk under the auspices of BC, focusing on reception purely as it operated in the West hardly seems appropriate. So I wanted to use this as a chance to bring together some of my different research strands and to explore certain areas that have come up again and again in sort of both sides of my own research. In particular, in this case, how popular Orientalism in the United States was mobilized by Middle Eastern immigrants and visitors, and how the kinds of associations conjured by this Orientalism affected Iraq's own image maintenance as a nation. This talk will look at a handful of times and places in Chicago, New York, and Baghdad, where Iraqis and Americans collaborated in imagining, displaying, selling, and interpreting the meaning of Iraq, past and present, between the 1890s and the 1950s. So a recurring theme here is American fascination with Iraq as a land with a special relationship to the origin of humankind and of civilization, and central to an Arab golden age, the real location of the Arabian Nights, thus evoking pleasure, luxury, and magic. So I want to begin in 1892, when two brothers from Baghdad stepped onto American shores for the first time. They were Joseph and Yak Usani, Chaldean Christians who, in their own description, could trace their lineage back to the ancient Babylonians. Born and raised in Baghdad sometime in the 1860s to a father who was a farmer and a sheep herder, the brothers became merchants, where they would travel to Tehran, purchasing rugs and other goods, which they brought back to Baghdad to be sold on to Europe and the New World. In 1892, the brothers set out on this even longer journey for an opportunity not to be missed. The 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition amounted to celebrate 400 years since Columbus's discovery of the New World. This fair was a crucial moment in the creation of modern American identity. The fair's so-called White City, which you see here, was a dream world with temporary plaster pavilions in neoclassical style devoted to arts, sciences, and history. Next to the White City was an area called the Midway Plaisance, officially under the control of the fair's ethnology department. This commercial strip was a sort of strange mixture of, it was a sort of sideshow ethnographic showcase. It was the Plaisance that called to the Usani brothers and a lot of other foreign merchants. The Baghdad siblings had come to Chicago to build and run a concession on the Midway called the Persian Palace on behalf of the Elia and Sabdullah Company. This kind of multi-regional collaboration and rather imprecise branding. So what we have here is Christian Baghdadis running so-called Persian shops under a company owned by the Jewish Suhami and the Muslim Sabdullah, a corporation based in Istanbul. This was typical of the so-called Oriental concessions at the fair, where a very diverse group of business people, craftsmen, traders, and performers from across the Middle East and North Africa came to make their fortune. So you can see the Persian palace there, and here you can see it again, located right next to one of the biggest attractions of the Midway, the world's first Ferris wheel, so designed by George Ferris for this occasion. Although the Midway featured concessions keyed to regions around the world, a disproportionate number were Eastern or Oriental themed, and these were also the most popular. The most famous of these was Cairo Street, the most popular attraction on the Midway, drawing an estimated 2.25 to 2.5 million visitors and pulling in the largest profit of any concession. The Ferris wheel was the second most popular. Various other Oriental villages purported to offer visions of different cities and regions within the Ottoman Empire, French North Africa, or Persia. These attractions traded in exotic Orientalist stereotypes, offering a mixture of purportedly ethnological education and pure popular entertainment. These concessions popularized the so-called hoochie coochie, or danse du ventre, the belly dance. The ethnographic stylings associated with this type of dance were just respectable enough to raise it above vice, while allowing audiences the chance to see women dancing seductively in various states of undress. The Usani's Persian palace allegedly had the most scandalous dancers of any venue, perhaps because they brought over French dancers from Paris, dancing a more shocking and arguably seemingly less authentic version of the dance. The palace was ordered temporarily shut down during the fair's initial season because of these dances, but the Usanis contested the ban and ultimately it reopened and remained open. The Persian palace and other Oriental villages or palaces also hosted various shops within, selling Middle Eastern luxury goods, as well as the experience of shopping in this sort of picturesque bazaar setting. Meanwhile, the official Ottoman pavilions within the exhibition itself, so not part of the ethnological Midway, displayed the Ottoman Empire as a modern, technologically advanced nation, which also boasted a venerable, unique Islamic architectural tradition. One American account of the official Ottoman efforts expressed qualified approval, its praise nonetheless indicating the extent to which Orientalist stereotypes might shape American perceptions of the largest Middle Eastern political power. Strange as it may appear, the author of a photographic chronicle of the fair noted, this semi-Oriental nation was the first to complete her exhibits at the fair. Remarking on the surprise of finding within a pavilion which reminds one of a Tartar tent an enormous modern torpedo, he notes that it looks like anything but the offspring of the somnolent Orient. For this commenter, technological progress and efficiency struck a surprising and perhaps discordant note within an Oriental pavilion. But back on the Midway, representatives from the Middle East proved themselves anything but somnolent when it came to giving the American public what it wanted as they ran and staffed various concessions. For the Usanis, the business success in Chicago inspired them to stay in the Oriental goods and entertainment business, and therefore to stay in America. When the fair ended, the Usani brothers did not return home, but moved on to New York City, where they went into business manufacturing and selling cigars and cigarettes, and imported Oriental wares. They were part of an increasing number of individuals from the Ottoman Empire who moved to the US around this time. These kinds of transnational lives did not only go one way. Merchants and importers kept connections back home and often traveled frequently themselves. So just two very different examples of these kinds of transnational lives. The Palestinian antiquities dealer Aziz Khayat lived a transatlantic life, estimating that he crossed the ocean between Palestine and New York 60 times in his life. My colleague Nicole Khayat, a descendant of Aziz, is writing an incredible chapter on him for the book that is forthcoming in a year or so with Bloomsbury. So you can look forward to reading about his career then. Example 2, the immensely popular poet Khalil Gibran emigrated to Boston as a young teenager, but then moved back to Lebanon, and then moved back to New York in adulthood, and sort of had this life lived between the two nations. In New York, Joseph Usani's flair for spectacular promotion, which had inspired him to bring in those scandalous French dancers when the Persian palace was originally not doing as well as hoped, that flair emerged again. Leaving Yak to handle the tobacco shop, he opened the Cairo Cafe on West 29th Street in downtown Manhattan. The name was probably intended to cash in on the enormous popularity of the Cairo Street concession in Chicago. In the cafe, New Yorkers, male and female, could smoke and drink together in opulent Orientalist surrounds. An 1897 New York Times report describes a Muslim wedding that allegedly took place before patrons in the Cairo Cafe. The Times speculated that it might be the first Muslim wedding to take place in New York, while expressing a great deal of skepticism about whether the picturesque event was real. Among other things, the article notes that the officiating Muslim priest was also a member of the orchestra, and that he removed his flowing white beard after guests had gone home. Passages, though, were read from the Quran, music played, and sword tricks demonstrated, while the wedding party wore what the article described as costumes similar to those from the Chicago Columbian Midway or Coney Island. Joseph Usani in the article is quoted declaring that he swore by the beard of the prophet that it was all genuine. As the scholar Linda K. Jacobs points out, given that Joseph was a Chaldean Christian, this promise was probably not worth much. One thing is clear, though. He had a flair for showmanship and a desire to mine the rich seam of American popular enthusiasm for the exotic East. Popular Orientalism between the 1890s and 1930s often equated the exotic beauty and excitement of the ancient East with the medieval or modern Islamic Middle East in one attractive melange of the so-called unchanging Orient. Americans in these decades could sit among Islamic-inspired Moorish architecture in shops, hotels, and gardens. It was a fair bet that a minaret on the skyline of an American city by 1930 was not a mosque, but a cinema. Within such film palaces, American cinemagoers made a star of the Sicilian immigrant Rudolph Valentino for his smoldering embodiment of the hero of one of the most popular romance novels of the day in The Sheikh, and its sequel, whose poster you see here, based on British author Edith M. Hull's 1919 novel of the same name, which suggested that an erotic encounter with a racialized Arab other was the ultimate romantic adventure, although ultimately revealing that the titular sheikh is really by birth a respectable Anglo-Spanish aristocrat, only adopted by a desert tribe. Americans also bought prints by Maxfield Parrish or L. Goddard, both of which you see here, of turbaned Islamic mystics and coal-eyed Cleopatras, leaning into the easy pleasures of poetry, music, and food. American lovers courted each other with British author Edward Fitzgerald's 1859 Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a translation and adaptation of works by the medieval Persian polymath and scholar of the title, perhaps in the 1884 edition with sumptuous illustrations by American symbolist artist Elihu Vedder, so also on that screen there. They might find spiritual revelations and poetic beauty in the work of already mentioned Lebanese-American author-artist Khalil Gibran, whose The Prophet in 1923 was an enormous success in the decade it came out and remains one of the best-selling books of all time. Americans of various social backgrounds and at varying locations on the spectrum of bohemianism to Babbittry dabbled in mystical orders or respectable clubs which linked their traditions to Egypt or Persia and styled their meeting houses in Egyptian revival. Wealthy businessmen opted for pyramid tombs over Greek mausoleums. In Chicago's Graceland Cemetery, Chicago school architects Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan and Richard E. Schmidt created notable examples for, respectively, Midwestern lumber baron Martin L. Ryerson, completed in 1889, and brewer Peter Schoenhofen, completed in 1893. I think that's actually the Schoenhofen, and that's Ryerson. In short, the Middle East, ancient and modern, had great popular and aesthetic appeal to millionaire and modestly provisioned Americans alike as a location of fantastic identification. The scholar Susan Nance has described some of these activities as playing Eastern and suggested that the idea of the Orient, particularly as embodied in the immensely popular Arabian Nights tales, was really about an identification between the fantasy of sudden fortune in those tales and the promises of American consumer capitalism. As she and others, including the scholar Linda Jacobs, who's written about the Usanis, point out, playing Eastern was an activity that was available both to non-Middle Eastern Americans who wanted to experience the fantasy of the Middle East represented in the Arabian Nights, but also to Middle Eastern immigrants and visitors, like the Usanis and numerous other participants in the Oriental concessions at the Columbian Exposition. The Café Cairo allowed New Yorkers to pretend for a moment that they were in one of those fantasies. For Joseph Usani, it certainly did represent the promised fruits of American capitalism as he became ever wealthier. This was not always smooth sailing. Joseph's cafes were accused of doubling as brothels, and he found himself sometimes in trouble with the police over illegal gambling operations. Yet he always emerged for a new scheme, and as the years went on, Joseph transformed himself from shopkeeper into a major property developer. He bought and sold real estate and built apartment blocks at Tony Addresses on the Upper West Side. In line with an early 20th century trend for exoticizing names for apartment buildings that suggested luxury and excitement, he called his apartment developments the Semiramis, after the legendary Queen of Babylon, and the Zenobia, after the legendary Queen of Palmyra. In the early 1910s, Joseph relocated his family to Fresno County, California for most of the year, while maintaining a base in New York. In California, he broke into another business. He bought agricultural land and began to grow grapes, becoming a California raisin king. A 1919 history of Fresno County noted that he is a decidedly live wire in the California Associated Raisin Company, predecessors of the Sun-Maid Raisin Company. He and his family regularly traveled to Europe and the Middle East, although it is unclear if they returned to Baghdad or only took the regular Western tourist circuit along the Mediterranean coast and to Egypt. By the time he died in January 1934 in a Harlem hospital in his late 60s or early 70s, he was memorialized in the New York Times obituary section only as a real estate developer. The slightly disreputable cafes he started with unmentioned. Usani had built his fortune on the popular enthusiasm for the Orient as a sometimes scandalous source of sensory pleasure and luxury, but died a man of capital, a builder and a farmer. And these are some of the places that his life took him. By the time he died, Joseph would have lived just long enough to read the coverage of another great World's Fair opening in Chicago. In 1933, Chicago celebrated the Century of Progress exposition. Iraq had become a nation in the meantime, which meant it would have been able to participate with its own pavilion, as the Ottoman government did in 1893. But for whatever reason, this didn't happen at this fair. Though the 1933 fair referred to its 1893 predecessor, it had a very different vibe, as you can see already, with the slogan, "Science finds, industry applies, man conforms." The theme of the fair was the progress of science. The architecture of the fair was a minimalist, streamlined modernism, a high water mark for that style. While it too had its Oriental villages and its sort of lowbrow edutainment concessions, other more serious scholarly institutions aimed to fit the theme of the fair with popularization of cutting-edge scientific research. So while Iraq did not send its own delegation, there were images from and of Iraqis in two displays of popular science, one by the Field Museum of Natural History, which was located adjacent to the fair itself, and one by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, today recently renamed the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. For these displays, Western academics working in Iraq brought material back from the country and used it to present a vision of Iraq, ancient and modern, that appealed to American fairgoers while also fulfilling a mandate to educate about the world. So let's look at the Oriental Institute display first. The Oriental Institute was founded by the Egyptologist and very influential public intellectual James Henry Breasted, mostly with the funding of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his foundations, which were enamored of Breasted's plan to create an institute to study the rise of man and his career, as Breasted put it, in the regions where he first struggled up from Stone Age savagery to the civilization that found its ultimate expression in the way that he pitched it to the Rockefeller Foundation in the modern US. Breasted invented the idea of the Fertile Crescent and associated Egypt and Iraq in particular with the very origins of civilization. In his contemporary dealings in the Middle East, Breasted was something of an Iracophile. He considered the young nation to compare favorably to Egypt, where he did most of his own research and whose relative hostility to the West he decried. The educated native citizens of Iraq are men of a high grade of ability, he wrote to a correspondent, who have all very warm feeling for America, while the young people of Iraq possess an unusual measure of intelligence. Breasted several times pitched Iraq as a good investment to his wealthy American funders at the Rockefeller Foundations, suggesting that they fund a grander version of the Iraq Museum and associated research institutes. At one point, he tried to interest the Rockefeller men in purchasing the entire site of Nimrud from the Iraqi government for $1 million US, noting that not only would the government be willing to offer Nimrud at this bargain price, but they would be willing to hand over to us an additional ancient city in Babylonia. Despite this appealing two-for-one offer, as far as I can tell, no one at the Rockefeller Foundations ever responded to or was interested in this pitch. In the early 1930s, some of the most promising research the OI was doing was in Iraq, where they were conducting excavations at Tel Asmar, ancient Eshnuna in the Diyala province, led by the Dutch archaeologist Henri Frankfurt. So when the Oriental Institute joined the fair for its 1934 extension series, mounting a display in the Social Sciences building, the stars of their show were recently pulled from the Iraqi clay, these Sumerian sculptures from Tel Asmar, dating to the first half of the 3rd millennium BCE. Upon discovery, these blocky sculptures presented a challenge to art history and to the taste of observers. To some, they appeared primitive and odd. To others, they appeared to anticipate cutting-edge trends in sculpture, as Jean Evans and Zainab Bahrani have both explored in their work. A photographer at the fair, undoubtedly with an eye for the comic, captured this image of two very bemused-looking patrons, face to face with these small, rotund human figures from almost 5,000 years before. These statues and all the finds at Tel Asmar were drawn into the ongoing debate about the Sumerians, including the racial origins of the culture, which increasingly seemed to archaeologists and Assyriologists to represent the true origins of civilization in Iraq, something which you can also read more about in Paul Collins' excellent book on the Sumerians. Unsurprisingly, the question of their racial identification was quite fraught. As Jean Evans has shown, art was drawn into this debate not only because of the seeming importance of art as a diagnostic feature of civilization, but also because art, along with human remains, was studied by physical anthropologists seeking answers to the Sumerian race question. Data for this endeavor came from excavations led by Leonard Woolley at Ur and from the joint expedition of the University of Oxford and the Chicago Field Museum at Kish, led by Stephen Langdon. Another researcher on these digs was Henry Field, assistant curator for physical anthropology at the Field Museum. He was the grandnephew of Marshall Field, the department store millionaire who endowed the museum and gave it its name. That museum grew out of exhibitions at the Chicago Columbian Exposition in 1893. But as well as analyzing ancient remains from the Kish digs, Henry Field produced the publication Arabs of Central Iraq, Their History, Ethnology, and Physical Characteristics. For this book, he took anthropometric measurements and photographs of some 1,000 Iraqi men throughout 1928, workers on the excavations at Kish, Bedouin in the area, and Iraqi army recruits stationed at nearby Hila. The long introduction to his anthropometric and photographic data was written by Arthur Keith, physical anthropologist at Oxford and Field's mentor. Keith explained the significance of Field's data in terms of how it could answer the puzzle of the racial origins and connections of the modern-day Arab people, which it would do in concert with the data obtained from the skeletons of ancient Sumerians excavated at Kish and Ur. Keith introduced the utility of the study in terms of how it provided comparative data for the physical anthropology he and others were performing on excavated Sumerian skeletons. The conclusions that Keith drew were perhaps predictable. The ancient Sumerians were, according to him, a Caucasian race highly similar to the modern-day Englishmen. The modern Iraqi Arabs were in large part direct descendants of them too, but were a degenerated form, exhausted by prolonged civilization. The obsession with the race of the Sumerians was part of a wider popular and scholarly interest in race at this time. And it was in this context that Field and Keith's analysis reached a popular audience during the 1933 fair, as part of the Field Museum's Races of Mankind exhibit. Drawing on contemporary race science, the exhibition presented racial types from around the world, sculpted in bronze by the sculptor Malvina Hoffman, in an exhibition overseen by Henry Field and introduced by Arthur Keith. Keith also served as the model head for an Englishman in the show, the only subject supplied with a name. In preparation for the exhibit, Hoffman was sent round the world on the Field Museum's dime to find models for her types. The notion of the type needs some explanation. The type was not a distillation of the absolute average, but rather a real individual seen to personify or characterize sort of typical features of their race. Physical anthropology attempted to quantify those characteristics through a series of measurements. But as Arthur Keith commented in his introduction to Field's study of contemporary Iraqi men, we can never hope to obtain, by the use of instruments, indices, and angles, the delicacy and precision of racial diagnosis reached by the tutored and experienced eye. So that was sort of what this exhibition was about. While some of Hoffman's busts were done from life, from people she met as she traveled the world, others were based on existing photographs taken by others. Models for sculptures were chosen on the basis of their value as racial types, but also on other criteria, including Hoffman's own aesthetic criteria, since she enjoyed sculpting beautiful people. Field's research on the contemporary population of Iraq provided Hoffman with the models for two types, Arab and Bedouin. The first man is identified in materials in the Field Museum as Sheikh Abu Hadal. I think it will be uncontroversial, probably, to say that we can all agree that he certainly met Hoffman's criteria for beautiful models. So he became this bust. The second bust also depicts a notably handsome man whose photograph was featured as a select group of larger portraits in Field's study of Iraqi men. He was a 25-year-old workman on the digs at Kish. As with other subjects in the book, he is unnamed. It is worth noting that unlike individuals who Hoffman met personally as she toured the world, these two Iraqi men fell into a group of people who probably had no idea that their images were being recreated in this exhibition. They might have consented to being photographed by Field for his studies, but probably they had no idea that they were now starring as Arab and Bedouin in the Races of Mankind show. On the Midway at Chicago's 1893 fair, the Orientalist entertainment had also been accompanied by a growing interest in racial types. Remember that the entire Midway was part of the fair's Bureau of Ethnology and was overseen by anthropologists. The book, Portrait Types of the Midway Plaisance, in which Jacques Usani's picture featured, so the nice picture of him that you see here is from that book, also depicted racial types. As in Hoffman's sculptures 40 years later, the notion of race here was shaped both by physical characteristics and expression and by culture and temperament. While both of these projects might seem equally objectionable and scientifically spurious today, I do want to point out a significant difference between 1893 and 1933. The fact that we had racial types represented by photographs of real people present in Chicago in 1893, but not in 1933, where none of the subjects of the bust was present at the exhibition except Arthur Keith. This is a difference of style, but it is also unsurprising in light of changes in American immigration laws between the two fairs. Starting in the late 1910s, a series of increasingly restrictive immigration laws, lobbied for on the basis of race science and mobilizing fears about racial degeneracy and miscegenation, slowed immigration to the US to a tiny trickle compared to what it had been in the 1890s. So the story of the Usanis, in which they came as visitors but settled in the US for good, subsequently brought other family members over and built tremendous wealth in the US, is not one that could have been easily repeated in 1933, when it would have been almost impossible for an Iraqi to settle in the US. So while Iraqis and other Middle Easterners were heavily involved in the presentation and sale of the exotic Orient at the 1893 exhibition, the 1933 fair, a scientific American gaze mediated the only presentation of material from Iraq. The people of Iraq were represented only by proxy, anonymized and not enjoying the benefits of their appearance in Hoffman's types and in the materials excavated by Iraqi laborers from the Iraqi earth in the OI exhibition. In 1939, however, Iraq did officially participate in the New York Century of Progress World's Fair, held in Flushing Meadows, Queens, today's Corona Park. While some countries built their own pavilions, Iraq took the more modest and less expensive route represented by this existing Hall of Nations that you see right here. So they took a sort of kiosk in the Hall of Nations. Overall, Iraq's official display there mobilized Orientalist consumer fantasies similar to those on display at the Columbian Exposition, but with a decidedly more family-friendly tone than the Usanis with their belly-dancing girls had once struck. The pavilion was a commercial proposition. Respectable-looking Iraqi women sold native textiles and dolls, like the one you see here that was for sale on eBay when I last checked. There were demonstrations of traditional music, and jewelry and other wares were on display. Overall, Iraq appears charmingly exotic, but not too wild or inaccessible, palatable to American consumer tastes. As far as surviving coverage goes, it seems clear that tastes in a literal sense were the main focus of the pavilion, which devoted by far the largest share of its attention to dates. The pavilion gave out dates and ran a restaurant called the Garden of Eden Cafe, which had a highly date-based menu. So you have cream of date, apricot and date sandwiches, date waffles, dates with everything. They sponsored a child date-eating competition. And they also served a date-based cocktail, the Oasis Quencher, combining rum with the juice of dates, limes, and lemons. They also served something called the Sandstorm, an Iraq-based cocktail, which allegedly, according to the New York Times, has been drunk in Baghdad since the 11th century. Date primacy was contested with the Turkish delegation. Each claimed that the Garden of Eden was found in their own country, and that the fruit Adam and Eve had eaten was really one of their own dates. The idea of Iraq as the location of the Garden of Eden was not only about claiming priority in the foundation of civilization, but also about associating Iraq with a fantasy of sensual pleasure, since the Garden of Eden was also a garden of earthly delights. Biblical links were evoked elsewhere, as we see in this coverage of Subian silversmiths brought over to work at the pavilion, who are described as peaceful, followers of John the Baptist, have been warless for 1,500 years. Through such demonstrations, Iraq promoted itself as a land of venerable history, literally the oldest history there was, and linked this history to the Bible, gustatory pleasure, beautiful craft, and peaceful pastoral existence. At the same time, the Iraq delegation also sought to use the fair as a chance for modernization, purchasing US aircraft, the most advanced on the market, while they were there. So this is a delegation of aviation experts at the fair. Peaceful Subian silversmiths aside, in 1939, obviously most of the world was focused on war, a specter that hung over the fair throughout, war breaking out before the fair was over, so it's not surprising that the Iraq delegation was also looking to national military capabilities. At the time, Iraq was ruled by the young Faisal II under the regency of his uncle Prince Abdul Ilah. In 1952, the 17-year-old King Faisal also journeyed to the US, so we're skipping ahead once again. He would attain his majority the following year, and the US tour involved visits to various sites of industry and agriculture, which he had come to study. He also met there he is with Harry Truman. He also met with the Iraqi community in Detroit and visited a mosque under construction in DC. But photographs from the tour indicate that it was mostly a tour of the most American sites you could dream of. In New York City, he visited Rockefeller Center, saw South Pacific on Broadway, attended a Brooklyn Dodgers game, and was interviewed by their star player, Jackie Robinson. He visited the White House, Washington's birthplace at Mount Vernon. He saw the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Here he is meeting a Huckleberry Finn. I'm not quite sure what this event was. Trying on a 10-gallon hat, wearing cowboy boots, visiting the Ford assembly line in Detroit, driving a Ford tank. He saw the Hoover Dam, the California redwoods, the Rockies. He ate American Chinese food in San Francisco. He sat poolside in LA. And he met the British actors, James Mason and Deborah Kerr, clearly on the set of the 1953 Julius Caesar. So I could go on here because there are even more pictures of him having an amazing time in the US. Both Faisal and his uncle were interested in orienting Iraq towards the West and the modernization that this orientation would seem to promise. What a demonstration this tour would have given him. As both a symbol and a real project of enacting this modern Western orientation, Faisal II, in 1956 to 1957, invited a number of the leading modernist architects of Europe and the US to present plans for buildings in Baghdad. This modernization was intended to support a bid for the 1960 Summer Olympics, ultimately a thing that never happened. Each major architect was assigned a commission. Le Corbusier designed a sports arena, Gio Ponti an office block for the development board, Walter Gropius and his architects collaborative a university campus. And Frank Lloyd Wright, America's greatest and most idiosyncratic modernist, then approaching 90, was given a commission to create an opera house. But Wright alone among Western architects was inspired to go beyond the brief, creating a wider plan for Greater Baghdad. Unhappy with the plot that he had been assigned, for the core of his plan, he set his eyes on a small island in the Tigris, which belonged to the imperial household, and which was not initially slated for development. But Wright put his idea to Faisal, and according to Wright, well, he put his hand on this island place on the map and looked at me with an ingratiating smile, and he said, "Mr. Wright, it is yours." Now that converted me to monarchy right then. Wright alone, among the Western architects, cared about the fact that he was designing for Baghdad. His fellow modernists mostly proposed to merely transplant the forms of modernist internationalism to Baghdad, modifying norms at most to reflect different climatic conditions of the area. But Wright, for whom regionalism was a core principle, was inspired to propose buildings deeply rooted in the history, myth, and fantasy of Iraq, designs that were simultaneously antiquizing, modernizing, and futuristic, not to mention Orientalizing. Wright proposed a total reshaping of Baghdad's landscape on geometric principles and buildings that referred to various forms of Iraqi architecture. The ziggurat, reimagined as a parking structure, the minaret, the mosque dome. Wright described to colleagues how his plan would demonstrate that we are not destructive but constructive, where the original forces that built the civilization of the world are concerned. And we are not there to slap them in the face, but to do honor to them according to our ability. This would not mean slavish imitation, but rather to use the principles and the ideas that made that originality a great force in human thought and feeling, he said. Wright, like James Henry Breasted and like the Iraq Pavilion at the 1939 New York Fair, identified Iraq as not just venerable in its history, but as literally the origin of everything, the place where civilization began. His plan included statues of Adam and Eve, famous original Iraqis. Wright's other point of historical reference was Baghdad's 8th century CE glory days under the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the monarch associated with establishing Baghdad as a center of learning and luxury, and a monarch who appeared in various tales of the Arabian Nights. In a speech to a dinner of Iraqi engineers, Wright proclaimed that, "I am one of the subjects of Harun al-Rashid by the way of the tales of the Arabian Nights, and I know nearly every tale of the Arabian Nights by heart, even now as I had them when a boy." He planned a statue of the ruler atop a form inspired by the 9th century minaret at Samarra. And he sort of reiterated his love for the Arabian Nights in other pieces that he wrote for the architectural press. Wright's enthusiasm was not exaggerated for the Baghdad audience. His own children's playroom in the house he designed for himself in Oak Park, Chicago, featured a mural of the fisherman and the genie tale from the Arabian Nights. In 1928, he's writing in 1928, when he sought a metaphor to explain how the sight of steel converters on the Chicago skyline had moved him as a young man studying under architects Louis Sullivan and Denkmar Adler, he said that the red glare of the ultra-modern converters thrilled him, quote, as the pages of the Arabian Nights used to do, with a sense of terror and romance. The Arabian Nights were a core text for American culture in the mid-19th century when Wright was a boy, through the first half of the 20th century. As I have discussed already, I find very convincing the analysis of Susan Nance that for many Americans, the text seemed to echo the promise of American consumer capitalism. The Arabian Nights, and by extension the world of medieval Baghdad, could serve as a double of prosperous contemporary America. A good example of this connection can be seen in this 1923 Maxfield Parrish painting, which presents medieval Baghdadi lamps as predecessors to the Edison Mazda light bulb, named for the Zoroastrian deity Ahura Mazda, which is what this is an advert for. Advertising suggested that American scientific innovation and capitalist prosperity ultimately recreated the kind of luxurious idyll associated with the medieval Islamic world. Parrish, the most popular commercial illustrator of the early 20th century, also created illustrations for a 1909 edition of the Arabian Nights, some of which you see here. Looking at the kind of popular Orientalism that the Usanis and even the Iraq pavilion at the 1939 fair sold, it's easy to see that connection between Orientalist fantasy and American capitalist fairy tale. Fairy tales that for someone like Joseph Usani, who died an extremely rich man, really did seem to come true. We can also understand why Orientalist concessions fit in so well at US World's fairs dedicated to showcasing the promises of the scientifically advanced future. Even if they sold a fantasy of a timeless, somnolent Orient, they evoked images of prosperity and wealth that also characterized American visions of that scientific future. The collaboration between the patron Faisal and the architect Wright produced an image legible to both. To Faisal, Wright and his designs conjured the promise of Western-style prosperity and modernity, even as this came filtered through evocations of the original prosperous, multicultural, market-friendly modernity in medieval Baghdad. The Western modernity that Faisal wanted to buy was being sold back to him by Wright as really originally Iraqi. But Wright's design was never to be. Whatever Wright's positive feelings about monarchy and its patronage of the artist, the Iraqi people did not necessarily agree, and Faisal II was overthrown and killed in the 1958 July Revolution. Some of the plans that had been drafted by the great modernists Faisal had assembled in 1957 were retained and built at later dates. Walter Gropius's design for the University of Baghdad started construction in 1963, and Gropius oversaw its progress until his death in 1969, while Le Corbusier's plan for a gymnasium suitable for the 1960 Baghdad Summer Olympics that were never to be was built in 1978, as the Saddam Hussein Sports Complex, the last Le Corbusier work. Wright's fantastical image of a futurist landscape carved from the rivers and islands of Baghdad was deemed extravagant and unrealistic, so it retains the purity of the utopian dream that was never realized. As I hardly need to tell anyone here, entanglement between Iraq and America continued to shape both nations, right up through the devastation of the 2003 US-led invasion and beyond. It is now difficult to read US-Iraq relations without the shadow of this invasion looming in the future. But with the stories we have looked at today, I have tried to think about US-Iraqi cultural exchanges without anticipating that ending. Instead, considering the give and take of cultural fantasy and cultural capital, the travels and tours of individuals between the two countries, whether entrepreneurial businessmen like the Usanis, academics like Breasted and Field, political elites like the aviation envoys sent to the 1939 fair, or the young King Faisal at his Dodgers game, and nostalgic but also future-oriented Americans like Wright, who found in Baghdad the potential for transformation that Iraqis visiting America had also enjoyed. Located somewhere between kitsch and high art, science and fantasy, I think we can see Iraqis and Americans as enchanted by similar dreams of discovery, prosperity, and pleasure, which seem to blossom in these kinds of contact between these two nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eva, it's fallen to me to give the vote of thanks. It was a wonderful talk. Thinking about reception, of course, one normally starts with the ancient world, with the classical world, the Greeks and the Romans, which underpin so much. Much has been written on that subject. Egyptomania, of course, again, we're all very familiar with. And when it comes to the ancient Middle East, of course, we know about Orientalism and about Assyrian revival. But what your work is doing is opening up this extraordinary popular Orientalism and showing how it was so ingrained in more recent histories and helping to shape modern identities. And so really contributing to the way in which our interests, the ancient Middle East, continue to inform and shape identities in the Western world. And we all look forward as a result to reading your forthcoming books, which will illuminate this more. I've spent many a happy moment talking to you over the years about ancient Assyria and learnt, as a result of that, so much more about modern reception. So thank you for that. Thank you for this wonderful talk. And there will be opportunities, of course, to explore this further in the reception, which we invite you now to join us in. But please join me for the moment in thanking Eva for this really exciting talk. Thank you.
Thanks.